So recently on Instagram, I shared a post defining the word polyffectionate, which is a term created by aromantic folks to describe polyamory, but for things that are not romantic or sexual. So, for example, a polyaffectionate person may have multiple partners, but they may be platonic partners or queer platonic partners, relationships that don't and aren't rooted in romantic or sexual attraction. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Well, this post ended up being a very popular post, lots of people sharing it and commenting on it. And a lot of the comments sounded like, so you mean like just having friends, right? So yeah, like a friendship. So, people love to be edgelords on posts that they don't understand, and this was absolutely no exception. But it did highlight the fact that platonic relationships outside of friendships are very misunderstood. So, let's talk about it. So let's start by defining platonic and platonic attraction. The most commonly accepted definition of platonic is not romantic and not sexual. So platonic attraction would be attraction to someone that is not romantic or not sexual, but that you want to develop some kind of intimate connection with them. And in this case, when we talk about intimacy, we are not talking about sex or physical intimacy, just intimacy between two people. That's the sort of commonly accepted definition. It's the definition you'll find generally in the wikis and generally in dictionaries and things about platonic. But as you know, language is constantly evolving, and there are some conversations in ace and arrow circles that look at platonic and platonic attraction slightly differently. And in those conversations, the attraction just excludes romantic. In these conversations, in some ace and arrow circles, platonic connections, platonic relationships could include sex as part of them, but not necessarily sexual attraction. It's one of those like aspect gray areas. So for our purposes, I want to use that most common definition that platonic relationships and platonic attraction are wanting to develop intimate connections with other people that are not romantic or sexual. I want to stay in that area because until that evolving conversation becomes more commonly accepted, both across ace and arrow spaces and more broadly, I want to just leave that as like an evolving discussion. I want to acknowledge that it's there, but we're not going to work with that as our foundation. So when we begin a conversation about platonic attraction and platonic relationships, the most common assumption is that we are just talking about friendships. Right? The common cultural understanding is that if I am not in a romantic or sexual relationship, I am in a friendship, and that is the only form of platonic relationship that exists. And we're going to talk more about that assumption in a little while, but first I want to talk about the different kinds of platonic relationships that can exist outside of friendship. Friendships aren't the only kinds of platonic relationships that can exist. We can form platonic connections with other people and construct relationships around those connections that aren't only friendships. For example, one could develop a platonic connection with a person and then use that connection to form a relationship that occupies a similar space to like a marriage or other kinds of romantic relationships that we place at the center of our lives. That kind of platonic relationship is different from a friendship, but it's still platonic. It's just a platonic partnership. It contains slightly different expectations, it contains different responsibilities to each other, and it occupies a central space in someone's life. We can also include queer platonic relationships under this umbrella as well. While these relationships, as you know, queer platonic relationships contain maybe elements of romantic or sexual relationships or those kind of relationships, but not necessarily be them. They are like rooted in like a platonic connection. Queer platonic relationships fall under this rubric too. Those aren't friendships. We can also look outside of paired relationships to see other examples of platonic relationships. If you look at things like intentional families, groups of people who are connected together through a variety of means, but their connection is to each other as a unit. It's intentional, but not familial in the traditional sense. That can be a platonic relationship. It just has more people in it. Where I think the real difference is when it comes to platonic relationships other than friendships is in its function in the lives of the people in it, its centrality, its importance, the weight one places on that relationship, that changes it into something other than what we culturally understand as friendship. Now, granted, a lot of those relationships, you could be thinking to yourself, well, I mean, yeah, you can just have like a really important friendship. But there's an important distinction to be made around what we mean when we talk about friendship, and let's get into that. You could define friendship as simply any platonic relationship, right? Any relationship that doesn't include romance or sex, that's a friendship. Platonic, they're equal, they're the same. But defining friendships in that way misses the way we culturally think about friendships. And I think that distinction is incredibly important. When we talk about friendships, we don't just have to talk about the substance of those relationships, but we need to talk about how those relationships are perceived, constructed, and placed in a larger hierarchy of relationships in our culture. And when we say friendship, we're not just talking about what is inside that connection. We are talking about where that relationship fits in the larger structure of relationships. Friendships are generally considered to be on the extremities, on the margins of our lives. They're not things that we can place at the center. We consider friendships to be not necessarily serious, intimate connections with other people, right? They're discardable. We consider friendships things we toss to the side when a real romantic relationship shows up. We also expect everyone in a friendship to think that way about the relationship. Not just the person who finds a romantic partner and spends less time with their friends. That's expected. It is also expected that the friend who is no longer being spent time with understands why and isn't bothered by it at all. We also consider friendships to be things that we grow out of. On the relationship staircase, which is the cultural idea that places relationships in a hierarchy moving upward towards monogamous marriage, friendship is at the bottom of that, right? Friendships are things we grow out of, that we use as stepping stones to move up the staircase, to grow into relationships that are more adult, more real, more substantial. Culturally, we treat friendship really poorly. And you could see that in the responses on that post. Everyone was referring to it as just friends. That construction of the disposability of friendships is key to how we think about and understand, build, and treat friendships in our culture. So when we speak about that diversity of platonic relationships, that's why friendship isn't all of them. While a friendship and those other forms of platonic relationships may contain similar or exactly the same components, it's the way we culturally think about them or the way the people in those relationships prioritize them that separates them and make them separate things. And while we as individuals may inside of our friendships untangle that cultural conception from friendship, culture isn't doing it. So even if we can think about friendship in a more holistic way that encompasses all of those different kinds of platonic relationship forms, the culture will never do that. So we're always butting up against it. And that's why I think it is useful to separate friendship from other forms of platonic relationships. It acknowledges the way culture treats friendships, the way culture conceives and constructs friendships, and the way we are expected to behave within them. So there are two big reasons why this conversation is valuable. First, it opens up a space to treat with respect and care platonic relationships that are not friendships. Not only is this aromantic affirming, but in general, it allows us to look at relationships in our lives that are not sexual and not romantic and really think about their contents and how they matter to us. It allows us to see those relationships in other people and treat those relationships with the kind of respect those relationships deserve. It doesn't render invisible platonic relationships that serve very important functions in people's lives. And ultimately, it helps us move through the world with a more expansive notion of relationship possibilities. Instead of kind of looking at a wide spectrum of different kinds of relationships and slotting them into one or two very narrow, rigid boxes, we are instead looking at many possibilities and allowing people an imaginative space in which the relationships in their lives can be built to accommodate their specific needs. The other reason why it's so important, it helps friendships. This conversation forces us to think about the way we conceptualize friendships and whether we are adding to or perpetuating that cultural notion of friendships as lesser, as dispensable. It helps us treat our relationships and the friendships of other people with some respect that they aren't often afforded, and it increases our skills in managing friendships in a positive way. If we are people who treat friendships with the kind of respect that friendships deserve and appreciate the variety of platonic relationships that exist, if a romantic relationship comes into our lives, we don't discard our friends because we know better than that. Understanding and treating all kinds of platonic relationships with respect helps us treat our friends better. And I think everyone who is a friend or has a friend can find that to be a valuable thing. If you want to know more about platonic relationships and other kinds of relationships that are affirming for ace and arrow people, check out my book, The Ace and Arrow Relationship Guide. I wrote all about platonic relationships and other kinds of relationships. It's a great book. It's out. Go get it. And if you enjoy the video, please subscribe and do all the things that people on YouTube ask you to do to support their channels. I will see you soon in the next video. And as always, friends, I'm glad you're here. A big thank you to my Patreon subscribers. These awesome folks help keep AceDad Advice going. So if you like this video and the other work I do, why not join us? Patrons get bonus content, discounts on digital workshops, access to the AceDad Book Club, and more. The link is in the description.